So thank you once again. As I was introduced earlier, my name is Pablo, and I work with the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. My response to the film, I mean, wow, right? I mean, too often, unfortunately, in our histories, there's a reason why the word history is history, right? And not herstory. Unfortunately, too many times the stories of struggle, of accomplishment, of fierce fighting and activism of women in history goes erased. And I think this is a prime example. And if there's anything that I think I would take from it is that there's a real need for all of us to fight for, you know, discovering, sharing, and promoting the stories like these, because I think if there's anything I really took away is the need for it to be seen so that people have these examples, so people see it, live it, experience it, and aspire to it. And so that would definitely be what I took away from it.
My name is Carrie Michaels. I'm with the BC Government and Services Employees Union, and thank you for having me here and for hosting this wonderful film festival. And these movies were really powerful. In my role at the BCGEU, I'm one of the co-chairs of our International Solidarity Committee, and we do a lot of work in partnership with workers around the world, and they truly are partnerships, and I think that that was an important point. I think that you made earlier, it's about relationships, and it's in our union, we've moved away from this model of charity and actually firmly grounded in the idea of solidarity, that your struggles are our struggles, and we have to be struggling together. Sort of my own, just coming out of watching those two movies, I have more questions than I do statements, and more questions to the audience, which is, who's ready to go out and organize? Who's ready to make some trouble for some bosses and to make rich, wealthy elites afraid again? Like, let's go, let's do this, let's take this up right now. That's kind of my feelings coming out of this.
Shom Toli Haq. To me, there's so many things I'm going to comment on the Dolores film, and I wanted to sort of maybe speak from a personal point of view, because I think in my keynote I was very much talking about the process of the film and the film itself. I want to share that I'm an immigrant from Bangladesh. I grew up in a working class community. My mother is a single mom, member of Love and 99. So, you know, in many ways, she wasn't able to, even though she had education back in Bangladesh, she wasn't able to do a lot of the things I'm able to do, because I'm sort of kind of the second generation. I went to college on a scholarship from the union. So my whole life has been sort of really about worker empowerment. And so I see and one of the things she always sort of would say to me is that no one's gonna know my story. I was just a mother, right? And so to me, that's really drives a lot of the work that I do. And also just, I also feel as a mother, I'm a mother of 2 kids. I'm here in Vancouver. Today is my son's birthday. And so like the pain of being in the movement and struggling, to me, this is not a job. This is like, I feel the way Dolores feels. I feel the pain, and I kind of the tension, you know, that worry that sometimes that you do have to make some sacrifices. We all do. But I also kind of get inspiration from the organizers in Bangladesh who are talking about dying, and I don't think we should all have to die, but just that I really want to see that sort of power, that sort of like we all have to be in it, you know, to bring about the sort of fundamental social change. But I also want to sort of speak to, there's enormous sacrifices. And so when you see an organizer, like, you know, really touch to that part of them, because they're giving enormous amount of sacrifices, they're maybe away from their family, they're choosing maybe not to live a life that's comfortable for the greater good. And so just, I think that piece of it really, there's a lot of pieces in the film, but I think that to me really hit me personally, because I think that's the one that's most invisible. We always have food at our meetings, because the thing is, the reality is that if you're organizing working people, Like sometimes that organizing meeting might be the like meal they get, making sure that they get home and back. Like some of these things we shouldn't take for granted. There's an enormous amount of sacrifice that goes into organizing. It's not as like, this sounds great and it's glamorous when it's behind the podium, but behind the scenes, it's really tedious. So I think that's the piece that I wanted to like speak to. Oh yeah.
An extra mic. Good evening. I would like to thank the organizers, KDocs, the KDocs organizer for having us here, for having Immigrant BC here tonight. I wrote my introduction because I get nervous speaking in public. So I'll just put in every once in a while my reflection and the parallels I saw with how I struggle as a migrant worker with the farm workers that we saw here tonight. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Filipino farm workers that were also there in the film. That was just part of it, but we see the importance of working together, right? So it's not just about being Filipino or being Mexican or being, it's important that we work together. So again, my name is Hesed, and I'm a community organizer with Migrante BC. I also work as a nanny under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, and I'm currently trying to apply for my permanent residency. As with other migrant women in this program, I'm hit very hard with the changes that in the requirements for status eligibility, which is required to prove language capability as well as educational units. These requirements plus other factors, very personal factors as well, have doubled the price to apply for my status. So I'm looking at more than $1,700 just to apply for permanent residency. And as someone earning minimum wage, the cost to apply for status is a lot. This is on top of my responsibility to send extra money home for my daughter, whose father, my estranged ex-husband, does not provide child support. So, however, the question is, how did I get here? Why did I end up being a migrant worker? I was a registered nurse in the Philippines, but unfortunately, I was unable to find work related to my profession. And my experience is not special. It's not isolated. Every day, 4,500 Filipinos leave the Philippines in search of employment. And my country's government actually designed the program called the Labor Export Policy, which turns Filipinos into commodities, much like bananas or apples or cattle. And we are being shipped in large quantities. To date, 10% of the population of the Philippines is not in the Philippines. It's outside of the country. So you can really see labor export policy with the multitudes of Filipinos leaving the country on a daily basis. So the inequalities and injustices that Filipino workers face here, specifically here in Canada and BC, is deeply tied to the socio-economic policies made by the government of the Philippines. So, Migrante BC not only joins the call of other organizations for status upon arrival of migrant workers, but also recognizes the roots of migration. It is tied to the problems back home. And as Migrante works to organize Filipino migrants, we also seek to build bridges with other organizations and unions, obviously, because farm workers and nannies like myself are unable to unionize. We recognize the need to work together for substantial change to happen. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Raj Chouhan, and thank you to KDocs for organizing this wonderful evening for all of us to be here. I'm the founding president of Canadian Farmworkers Union in Canada that we started in 1979, 1980. And during that time, I became very good close friend of Cesar Chavez. He's my mentor. He's the one who taught me. In my work during that time, I had opportunity to meet with Dolores twice. Once when I was in Delano in 1981 in Cesar Chavez's house, we were sitting there, and I'm, just 30-year-old and sitting and just wondering what the hell, like how am I going to respond to these two legendary, leaders, what would I take back with me? But it was amazing, amazing experience. Like both of them were amazing human beings. And Dolores, like her personality, like you sit there and just try to soak in whatever you can, but not enough. And second time I met Dolores was when Cesar Chavez passed away in 1993. I was one of the pallbearers, and I met with her again, and we shared some of our thoughts, experiences. But every time, those two moments in my life were the wonderful moments that I would always cherish. As what I take from this film is the struggle continues. It's not over. In 1970s, in 1973, when I came to Canada, my goal was, like my other two brothers, I wanted to be a lawyer. And so, in the summer of 1973, I was waiting to the school to start. In the meantime, I had no money. So I saw an ad in the paper that a labor contractor was taking farm workers to Fraser Valley to do some harvesting. So I said, well, why not? We'll go with him and see what's going on there. So I called him. He said, no problem. I'll pick you up tomorrow, free transportation. I said, that's wonderful. I don't have to pay for bus fare. So he said, I'll pick you up at 4:30 in the morning. I said, no, that's too early. He said, okay, 5:30. So we compromised. So he came within a Econoline van, came and, when I opened the door, there were about at least 22 people in that small van, no seats. I said, maybe that's how Canada was, because I just came recently from India. Got to the fields, and we saw conditions were so horrible. And I, around 11:30, asked the next person standing to me, and I said, is there any washroom here, or something, running water? He said, is this your first day? I said, yes. He said, no, that's the bush, that's the ditch you can drink from. So I said, is there a union that we can talk to? I didn't know that he was the son of farmer, so I didn't even get the ride back home. I was fired 5 times in 5 days. That's how stupid I was. But I gave up the idea to go to law school. I said, well, something needs to be done about farm workers. So I did some research, came to know that workers in California, they did it. I said, oh, well, if they can do it, why can't we do it here? So it took us many years to come to a point where we could start the Farm Workers Union. But in the meantime, I had the honor to meet with these two wonderful people, and that's when we started it. So we came a long way. In 1990s, when the NDP government came to power, that we made lots of changes to Employment Standards Act, Labor Code, and everything. But then we went back to square one in 2001. Now I'm the Deputy Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. Came a long way. What I want to say one thing. Even though I belong to the governing party, the NDP now, but I ask always all the workers, don't take it for granted. You have to stand up for your rights. Even if it's a friendly government, if you don't stand up and speak up for your rights, nobody is going to give it to you. We work with politics, we work around politics, we have to compromise, we have to do lots of things, but when workers make the case in the strongest possible manner, governments listen. So we have to continue to do that. So yes, we can, we must do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, panelists. And now let's open it up to the audience for questions and comments. Please raise your hand, and a runner will bring a microphone over to you. We'll try our best to maintain a speaker's order.
Raj, I understand that the BC Farmers Union isn't that powerful today. Could you briefly talk about the situation of what's going on?
the Canadian Farmworkers Union, yes, is not very strong now. Like from 1979 until 1986, we had about 7 major collective agreements. As you all know, the farm work in British Columbia is very seasonal, transient, and the workforce is not always there year-round. So we lost almost all of those collective agreements, at that time. And now it's still there. It does educational work, advocacy, but in reality, the union is not there. But now, I've been working with temporary farm workers who come here, so we have to get their rights that they need. I was honored to receive Black Eagle Award from UFCW a few years ago, but UFCW is the one who's now carrying the torch. UFCW has done wonderful work. CFU, the Canadian Farmworkers Union, is not very active now.
We saw in Dolores that the boycott of the farm industry and the grapes worked in their favor. Do you think boycotts are still relevant now? Do you think it works? Or how do you think, we as consumers should proceed?
I think boycott is a very powerful weapon that, we must never give up. When there is some sort of discrimination, injustice going on, yes, that's the power we have, and we must, use it all the time. That's my opinion. I think, it has worked. It will work.
As a nanny, I help to send off a mother and a father to work. So I believe that if all nannies and if all caregivers stop working even for one day, it would cripple Canadian society, I would believe. And also, when it comes to overseas Filipino workers sending remittances, we actually have a campaign where we don't remit for one day, because one day without remittance from overseas Filipino workers would cripple the economy of the failing economy of the Philippines. So boycotting, I think, truly works, but everyone has to be on board.
I just want to add that, I think in the film, it was said that strategies and tactics really need to be understood. And so, I'm legally trained, but my heart and thinking is always as an organizer. So to your question, it can't be answered out of context, right? So what are the full range of strategies that are available to bring about change? And I think one of the things in the film that you saw that Dolores was constantly thinking about strategies and tactics. If some particular strategy didn't work, doing the walk, right? Going to DC. She didn't go to, I don't know, I'm from New York. I don't think you would go to DC just because you like DC necessarily, but using all strategies in your sort of toolbox, work slowdowns. You don't have to do an outright boycott, but I think we should never eliminate any strategy that is in our toolbox to bring about change. I'm part of March 8th women's strike that's being organized, and the idea is not necessarily that you just stop working, because not everyone can afford to do that, right? But to think about strike or boycotts in the sense of resisting and not accommodating to a system that exploits you. And I think that when we think about economic struggle broadly, I think that boycott has a powerful place, strikes have a powerful place, work stoppages, slowdowns have a powerful place. There's lots of different tools that labor and social organizers use to really push the system towards justice. So March 8th is one example. Another non-labor example I want to give is the boycott and divestment movement for Palestine. I think BDS as a movement has demonstrated that through grassroots organizing, through a clear moral vision, you can actually be effective in using these tools, but every strategy and tactics must be understood within political organizing context. It can't just be out of there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that because I think that was similar. I just want to add that the context in which that boycott was taking place was within a strike of the farm workers. And I think in that sense, you know, the farm workers are already saying we're not going to be producing what creates profits for the employers, and we don't want people to be buying the products which create those profits as well. And in fact, we're also informing people that scab labor was what was on the shelves in terms of the grapes that were being produced and picked and sent to grocery stores. And so I think that that strategy and that tactic was very effective in that case. And I think we always need to be conscious of what really forces change, and that's economic power. And the one tool that workers have in terms of actually getting their demands heard is that they have the ability to strike and withdraw their labor power, which is what the employer relies on to be in business, regardless of what that business is. And I think it's important also to remember that in Canada, we can have rights to be in unions, and we actually, you know, have a right to strike, but it's a limited right to strike. There's conditions. In order to have a legal strike, you have to be, your contract has to be up, and you have to apply at the labor board, and you have to fulfill all of these mechanisms in order to actually walk off the job, let alone if you're not considered an essential service by the government, which adds other layers of complications. But I think even recognizing in Canada, we don't even fully have the right to strike whenever we want to. You have to be unionized, you have to apply. And so to be able to withdraw that labor power to get your demands met is still limited within even the rights that we have here.
Yeah, I would just, one of the advantages of answering a question after four other brilliant people is that everything's been said and so eloquently said. And I totally agree with what all the panelists have said. I would only echo it in saying that boycott really is only as powerful as your movement is, right? And so sometimes it's thrown, sometimes the idea of a boycott's thrown out as a very romanticized notion of what we could potentially do. And I think it's absolutely a tactic that should and can be explored and utilized. But it really only is within a context that allows you for momentum to actually carry it to the broader community, right? And so I think you have to be well organized. You have to have a real good strategy on how you're going to popularize a movement or something like a boycott for it to actually be effective. And so to definitely echo the idea of really having to know the strategy and actually be able to carry out what it is that you want to accomplish with a boycott is really important. And I only say that because I know in the labor movement and other movements, we get really enamored with ideas and tactics that have been employed by others without necessarily truly examining whether or not we're absolutely prepared to carry out something to fruition.
Good evening. I first want to thank I want to thank all of you for your collective years of service as community organizers and sacrifice. Definitely want to honor that. And specifically, as people of color, listening to Dolores and Dr. Davis talk about unifying of movements and how solidarity was so important, how within your community organizing are you working to deal with it, like internalized racism, classism, and sexism?
So if we can answer it in a minute, then I think we'll all be in greater shape. But I can just touch on pieces from my personal example of constantly bringing it up. So as a Muslim American, we right now in the United States, as you know, there is tremendous amount of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and that's happening. And what's interesting recently is the South Asian broader community is pretty diverse. So there's different people from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, different faiths. About 800 Indian Americans put up signs in support of Trump and saying they were H-1B visa holders, or they're the tech holders, and saying, give us the legalization and basically throw everybody else under the bus, while we've been organizing to save people from deportation and separation of families. So that's like a very current example of a lot of internalized Islamophobia within brown people. Amongst Muslims, when you see like who's sort of presented forward in the United States, the Muslim organizing movement started really with black Muslims. The first Muslim that came to the United States was an African enslaved Muslim, and then also free. So for those of us who came much later, and I really love and appreciate the way every panel has began in honoring of First Nations. And so as Muslims, we have a lot of internalized racism. When we look at who is presented as our leaders, it's oftentimes a light-skinned Muslim. I'm going to be real about that. And so we have to have these really courageous, loving conversations within our communities about our own biases. And I think just what we've been doing is using a lot of just the house meetings. I hold house meetings like in my apartment. I don't have a house. And we address some of these kinds of issues, because if I don't really know you as a person, as a whole person, and I just sort of present you as a category, there's no radical and revolutionary love right there. And I need to find a place to see you and to also hear where you're coming from. And that's from only that place can we really bring about change. So it sounds very, not very concrete, but just like really having the courageous conversation filled with love and hearing. Sometimes, for example, I live in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. I'm married to a Dominican, so I have interfaith, intercultural children. And I'm always asked, why do you live with the black people amongst Bangladeshis? And I do so much work in the Bangladeshis. And I'm like, you see my skin color? Like, right? So there's just so many, it's a daily conversation that we need to have. It's, and I can go on and on offline to share about concretely house meetings, engage in those difficult conversations. And sometimes it's gonna be uncomfortable. You're gonna have conversations with people you love, who you're also organizing, right? Who's gonna say something very racist. And you just have to be in conversation. And through the movement, I think if you build an inclusive movement, people are going to get. That's why the labor movement is so powerful, because they see their brothers and sisters on the line. It doesn't matter the color; they're all sacrificing. That's why, to me, it's the labor movement's the only way we're going to get to some of these issues. So that was more than a minute. I apologize.
Oh.
So I would just quickly respond by saying, I think that's a battle that, quite frankly, all of us should be having on a daily basis with ourselves. Sometimes before we even, project that onto others. And I think most people are guilty of it at one point or another to think about this question from an external standpoint. And I think one of the things I didn't say in actually my comments about the movie is that, sometimes we have to check ourselves and think how our roles or the privilege that we carry ourselves actually might be complicit in the erasure of women's stories, in the erasure of other people's space, or the ability to concede the fact that I, as, a light-skinned male, carry privilege where I walk. And it's not the same privilege that, let's say, my dark-skinned father or my mother carry with them. And so you kind of constantly have to question, how is it that I'm making sure that I myself am comfortable with what I'm doing and how I act and how I bring that to my work, whether that's organizing workers in their workplaces or working in communities. I really constantly have to check myself, and I think it starts with ourselves before we look externally. And so I don't know if that's an answer, but I do think it's a question that we do definitely have to ask ourselves. And I think it's okay at times to actually tell yourself, maybe this isn't a place that I need to take up a lot of space. Maybe right now it's my role to make sure that somebody else has access to this space. Maybe it's my role just to step back and let things, unfold. And in other spaces, maybe it is your place to take up a little bit more space and share your stories. But I think it's a constant battle internally, and if we're not having that on a daily basis with ourselves, I don't think we can pretend to have it with anybody else or think that others should be doing it.
No, racism, we have seen racism over centuries, and it's going to continue. The racism is not going away. So it's important that we stand up. It's important that, we become self-aware, the need to fight back. For the last 16 years in British Columbia, we were the only province in Canada, we didn't even have Human Rights Commission here. It's just, many people didn't know that, but that was the reality. In the 70s, racism was right in your face kind of racism. People were killed here in Lower Mainland. We started the organization called BC Organization to Fight Racism in 1980. I'm also the founding member of that. And we broadened it to include indigenous people, all ethnic communities, the labor unions, faith groups, everybody, because everybody face, racism, discrimination. Even if, if a person is white, they may think that they can walk on the street freely, but they are also facing racism because that they're living in a society where the racism is actively performed by many other people. So we have to stand up for that. It's not over. It's not going to be over. Now we have seen what Trump is doing. The people from the Muslim faith are facing so much discrimination now, it's unbelievable. We have to stand with our sisters and brothers in that community. We have to stand with our sisters and brothers in the indigenous community, First Nations. They are facing so much discrimination. So it's ongoing, and we have to just stand up and carry on.
First, that was like down memory lane for me, because I'm a Chicano from California. I was a kid when all that was going on. My older siblings, my cousins. Our school was mobilized, went to an all-Latino school. The whole neighborhood was Latino or black. And so we were all entrenched in all that. I think the difference is now down there, my sister lives in Oxnard, I go down quite regularly, is there have been, from when my relatives would come up from Mexico and live in the shacks with no water, and we would go see them, there has been a little bit of improvement. However, I believe that is complex, and I didn't even know there was a union of farm workers here. I think the differences now in this day and age are, I hate to say this, but back then it was driven along racial lines. It was Mexicans and Filipinos I give a big shout out to, because Napomo up on the coast was all Filipinos, and we were all friends with them, and they worked just as hard as anybody in the fields. So I give a lot of respect, and you're right, it was a very small thing that they had in the movie for them. But I lived in that whole area, Central Valley. My relatives lived, it was very involved in that. So the difference was, back then we still had the civil rights movement, and that's what kind of, unfortunately, that's the way it was driven. It was driven along racial lines. It was going to be Mexican, it was going to be Brown Pride, and South Pacific Islander Pride, or Filipino Pride. Down in California we say South Pacific Islander Pride, and that's why we had that momentum, because unfortunately that's what rolled. And so up here, like I said, I like to research this because I didn't know there was United Farm Workers. Up here, everyone thinks I'm East Indian, and I have many of my friends are East Indian, so I have an insight into the agriculture for that. But yeah, back then it was a different time, a different place. Yeah, there was sexism. That was really old school. My daughter looks very Latina, and believe me, I would never be sexist with her because she'll probably just knock my head off. But the, it was a really interesting movie because it took me back. But I would definitely, look into this more. And maybe.
It's true that lots of people don't know that we had a union of farm workers here in British Columbia. I will recommend to all of you watch a documentary called Our Time to Rise. You will see me and Cesar Chavez walking together in the fields. That film won the Best Film Award here in Canada, and Germany, and England, and India. It's a 38-minute documentary, so maybe next year, at the festival we can show that. It's really, educational. So have a look at that. I think it's available online.
Thanks. My name is Douglas Cook. I live up in the interior, up in Quesnel. I'm massive supporter of union movements and all of that, but I wanted to ask a question with regards to a couple very difficult times that some of the organizing that I do up there has ran into issues. And it came up a bit in the film too, in terms of the dynamics between the Teamsters and the UFW. I was very involved in a cooperative, a workers' cooperative that was very wanting to really pursue changes in forestry, in eco-forestry. We had a horse logger co-op all doing selection logging. We met 4 or 5 times with IWA heads and had experience of even sympathetic IWA members being forced out of the union because of wanting to see real grassroots change in terms of employment-intensive alternative forestry, all of that, and what we pursued. That was a first experience in terms of some really difficult dynamics. The second one is much closer, just in terms of the last few years, being a community member, really trying to get a proper justice and cleanup with regards to the Imperial Metals Mount Poly disaster. We met with the steel workers early on and said, you know, we have an opportunity to be on the leading edge of getting proper cleanup and remediation and proper mining standards in British Columbia, so this will never ever happen again. And unfortunately, our organizing just wasn't successful enough because the steelworkers became the mouthpiece for the company to open up the mine as fast as possible and continue the kind of ecological destruction that continues. So and seeing that it came up in the movie a little bit in terms of the dynamics between, and I know it's a difficult issue when we all want to see this success and the opportunities for workers' organizations to succeed. When it comes up with workers' cooperatives, and when it comes up with sort of really important ecological, community, health-related kinds of standards where there's differences, I just would like to get some feelings from yourselves in terms of how we can really try to make sure those divisions get worked through.
And if we look at the history of post-colonial states, like Canada has obviously a very sad and depressing post-colonial history. We can tie it with, like, when you were talking, I immediately thought of the connection between the struggles of Indigenous folks here with the struggles of the Indigenous folks back home. And it's still the same, and it's still going on. I think that we can tie it. We can tie it together and see who the real culprits are, who are the real villains of history and of today. And they are, you know, mining companies, forestry industries, and they're all wreaking havoc. And you know, as a migrant worker, I know for sure that the reason why there is both internal and external migrations in my country is because of the problem of agrarian reform, right? So in the Philippines, we the sector there, the agricultural sector there, are asking for genuine agrarian reform to address the root causes of poverty, of being impoverished. And it's the same here, right? The history of land grabbing, of doing away with the people that are actually here from the start, from the beginning. I think that is one and the same. They're not exactly the same, but when you see it, when you analyze it, those are, you know, the what happened here is also what happened there, and what's happening here right now is also what's happening elsewhere in the world.
I just wanted to thank you for your question, because I think there's something we need to acknowledge, especially within the labor movement, and that's why I really appreciated your comments earlier about reimagining what our labor movement could be, because I've seen similar things happen where there's definitely this issue where unions tend to oftentimes side with the employers when it comes down to really controversial issues. And I'll point back to what I was mentioning earlier in Canada with the change in rights to unionize, where workers were actually able to legally join unions and have them recognized by employers, but with that they gave up the right to strike at any time. And they gave up a lot of the rights and the powers that they had to take direct action to demand better. And this meant that unions shifted from being radical movement building organizations to basically managers of workers for employers. And that's, luckily, I see it changing a lot in unions. And you know, it's still, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think there's a lot of conversations that need to be had, not only amongst union executives, but also on the ground with rank and file workers who maybe aren't questioning why these things are happening, who believe that jobs need to be bestowed upon them by employers, and really unions need to be at the forefront of looking at other ways to organize workers and to build that power in the workplace and in communities as well. And so I think that there needs to be an honest discussion and examination of that for sure. And our union, the BCG, was one of the few that actually took a position on Site C and were opposed because we knew that environmentally it wasn't the best, and that Indigenous people have claims to that land that we can't ignore in terms of what that project was going to entail. And so for us it was important, and for our members, to say that that was something we needed to take a stand against.
So I feel like there's lots of different concepts that are coming up. I mean, like Dolores, I think that everybody has a inalienable right to self-determination and liberation. And so that, to me, is very different than necessarily a organizational formation of a union. And so, so there's going to be conflict, right? So there is the sort of individual self-determination. There's community organizing. To me, organizing is not necessarily unionization. Because a lot of workers, particularly domestic workers, agricultural workers, independent contractors, taxi drivers, for example, in New York City, cannot legally form a union, but they consider themselves a union. They are organizing and mobilizing. So oftentimes when there are trade unions that have a particular formation, they have a certain interest, right? And so I think that if we understand the system and the way that these interests operate, we can see them as sort of not necessarily, you know, I feel like some of that question, not from you, but when I hear that, my concern is that sometimes we then sort of want to throw away unionization or organizing because we think that, oh, look at these, yeah, these Teamsters are racist because they, like in the film, right? Also, in the Taxi Workers Alliance, when they started organizing, they were undermined. They're actually now also undermined when Uber, right? I hope nobody takes an Uber home, Uber, Lyft, or anything home, right? I mean, I don't know, walk or take your metro. They signed a sweetheart deal to undermine the organizing of predominantly Muslim, South Asian, African, and also Irish and other drivers, right? So there are these interests, and I think back to strategy and tactics and mobilizing and doing the hard work that comes out of not checking ourselves and doing the internal work around the political education work around racism. Understanding environmental issues are key, right? Rana Plaza happened also. There's environmental components to that. And that's the sort of educational work. But I have a right to be, that comes out of a radical movement around anarchism and socialism. I think we should name that. I don't know how Canada is. I mean, in the United States, we want to sort of do away with that. but some of the old organizers at the Wobblies, the Goldmans, right, came out of a radical history. So organizing, unionization, and interest, I think if we understand those concepts, know our history, then I think we can understand where these conflicts emerge. And the last thing I just want to say, you know, U.S. is going through a democratic crisis, right? But we never say we shouldn't have democracy anymore, right? We still fight for democracy. We still fight for those views. And so there are going to be these challenges and these tensions. And I think, to me, that's a signal of the work that we need to do, the conversations that we need to have, to deepen, because we really need to deepen sort of our movement work back to the grassroots, back to the person to person. And I think that when there doesn't have that understanding, it's because we haven't done the political educational work that needs to happen. So, but I really, as a lawyer, I always feel when people say, oh, I don't have a right to organize under the law. No, you have a right to organize. If you're breathing and you have a conscience and you think you see injustice, you have a right to organize. And I'm also informed by my faith, because in the Quran it says, you see oppression, even if it's by another Muslim, you organize against that oppression. So that is inherent to us, and I think that wherever animates you, excites you, like, organize.
Thank you so much to everyone for this awesome discussion. I think it was super important. We saw Sister Davis on the screen. I thought, since we're in the middle of Black History Month, I thought I'd do a little plug-in for Sister Davis. Not that she needed the plug, but she had a new book that's out, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. If you haven't read it, snatch it. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists, Raj Chouhan, Carrie Michaels, Hasid Torres, Shamtoli Haq, and Pablo Gadev.